All right, welcome back. So today, to finish our series on how did the old-fashioned become the old-fashioned, we're going to talk about the Manhattan. Now, namely, we're talking about a specific Manhattan, the Manhattan number 3. So there's a lot of different videos on the internet that'll show you how to make a Manhattan. And they're all going to show you the same Manhattan, which is a standard issue Manhattan that is 2 ounces of whiskey, 2 dashes of Angostura bitters, and 1 ounce of sweet vermouth. Now, that's a really great Manhattan. Now, there are other Manhattans, though. So the one that I'm going to show you was first detailed in the 1887 edition of the Bon Vivant's Companion, which dates back to 1865. The Bon Vivant's Companion was the very first cocktail recipe book ever written, and it was written by a guy called Professor Jerry Thomas. So Professor Jerry Thomas, throughout his life, made a bunch of different cocktails. In fact, the Tom and Jerry is very much named after Jerry Thomas. Now, when we talk about Jerry Thomas and the Bon Vivant's Companion, the first edition was in 1865, and the Manhattan wasn't even on the scene. It's not in his first copy of that book. That's why he released different versions. There are 2 recipes in the 1878 version, the standard issue one, and then what's called the Manhattan number 2. Now today, we're going to take a look at the Manhattan number 3. The reason is because I think it's the best Manhattan recipe that he came up with. It was the last one because that was the last edition that came out before he died. So I think that he improved upon the Manhattan over the course of his career, and this recipe is the most superlative one. Now, the reason that I love this recipe is because this is how I started making my Manhattans before I even read about him coming up with that recipe. The reason I started making my Manhattans this way is I was working in New York, and New York happens to have some pretty strict laws about how much booze you can throw into a cocktail, namely 4 ounces maximum. So what's appealing about this Manhattan recipe is that it is a 4-ounce cocktail recipe. So a lot of places you might have to charge it as a double Manhattan if you do make this at the restaurant or bar where you choose to work. So at any rate, we're going to get into it. This is an 1887 Manhattan. So we've got our mixing tin ready to go. Now what we're going to add to this is 3 ounces of whiskey. We're using bourbon today. I personally prefer it with a high-proof rye, but it doesn't matter as long as you're making a drink that you and or your guest likes. So we got 3 ounces of bourbon that we're going to add to this guy. This is one of the instances where I like to use a nice OXO jigger, because this guy's got 1.5 ounce measure on the one side and then a 1 ounce on the other. So I just have to pour this side twice and then the other side once, because I'm going to add 1 ounce of sweet vermouth to the mix. I read one bar book that I won't disclose the name of. I'll let you discover that when you read it. But they describe pouring from a jigger in like 7 steps. And I don't know. I don't think it's quite that complex. So there we go. We got our 3 ounces of whiskey in there. Now we're going to add 1 ounce of sweet vermouth. Which sweet vermouth do we want to add? This is a really important question. Now, when you're using a really high-end whiskey, honestly, you want to use a lower-end sweet vermouth in order to let the whiskey shine a bit more. If you're using a lower-end whiskey, you want to use a higher-end sweet vermouth to make a more balanced cocktail. It really depends. Try different vermouths with different whiskeys and try different ratios and different Manhattan recipes to find the Manhattan that you really like. For me, I like to normally use Carpano Antica Formula. It's a little bit of a more expensive vermouth, but I like to spend the money on the vermouth because I use less of it than the whiskey. That's just my preference. When I can't find Carpano Antica Formula, I like to use Punti Mez because it's got a similar flavor profile, a little bit lower on the vanilla, a little bit higher on the orange. Tonight I have neither of those. We're looking at a French sweet vermouth, Noir Plus, and then we've got this Californian vermouth, Via. Now, I've never worked with Via, so I'm going to play with that tonight just to see what I think. Noir Plus is a really lovely sweet vermouth. In the older bar books from the 1800s, even up into the Prohibition era and into the 1940s, they would talk about vermouth by describing not sweet or dry, but rather the country of origin. Country of origin being Italy, if you're talking about sweet vermouth, and France, if you're talking about dry vermouth. Today, both vermouths are made in both countries. This is a French sweet vermouth. But just so you know, if you're reading old cocktail recipe books and you're like, what do they mean, French vermouth? Look at that. What type of vermouth do I use? The answer is going to be French vermouth. Almost always refers to dry, sometimes blanc vermouth, depending on the cocktail recipe. And Italian vermouth always refers to sweet vermouth when you're reading these old cocktail books. So that's a little primer on vermouth. We could talk about that for a long time. Vermouth is absolutely delicious. Make sure you keep it in the refrigerator. It is a fortified wine product. So after opening, even if it's in the fridge and sealed, you got a couple of weeks, maybe a month at most. So just a heads up. Alrighty, so we're gonna pour our lovely sweet vermouth, 1 ounce right in here. Oh, it smells delicious. When you look at sweet vermouth, some are more grape forward, some are more herbaceous, some are more spicy. Some, like Carpano Antica Formula, have a little bit of vanilla in the background. Now, vermouth gets its name from the German Vermut, which means wormwood, because vermouths traditionally had wormwood in the blend of herbs and spices that they make them out of. It's a fortified wine. They then take a brandy, add herbs and spices to it, and then blend it together with the wine in order to make the vermouth. So, there you are. We're going to throw a little bit of ice. Oh, I can't possibly forget our bitters. So we're going to want to add a little bit of cocktail bitters here. Now, what else makes this a Manhattan number 3 other than just the bitters, whiskey, and vermouth? It's not just a different ratio. We're also going to add a bar spoon of maraschino and a bar spoon of curacao. And this harkens back to our improved whiskey cocktail and further exemplifies how the Manhattan number 3 shows a direct through line in the evolution of the whiskey cocktail to the Manhattan, and the Manhattan thus giving the name to the old fashioned as it became the more popular way to drink whiskey. So here we go, we got some Bodega Maraschino. Just a bar spoon of this is going to make a big difference. And then we've got our curacao. And same story here, we're just going to add a little bar spoon there. Now, I usually like to add 3 dashes of bitters to my Manhattan number 3. Experiment, play around with how much you like to add. Now that we've got all of our liqueurs in here, our bitters, we're going to add some ice and stir it up. The main difference between a Manhattan and an improved whiskey cocktail and an old-fashioned is that the sweet component is going to be our vermouth as opposed to a cube of sugar or simple syrup. All right, that'll do. Then I'm going to give this guy a little stir. And remember, our target temperature is going to be -6 to -8 degrees Celsius. That's what we're shooting for. We're going to grab a big cube and get ready to pour this on that big cube. Now, slightly less ice, so I'm going to give this a little bit more of a stir. Now, when you're stirring a cocktail, you're still diluting the cocktail because the ice is melting. The big thing is you're not aerating it like when you shake a cocktail, so it's not going to have a bunch of bubbles in it and be effervescent. Instead, what you're shooting for is a very silky, smooth, velvety kind of texture. You should increase the viscosity because you stirred it, and therefore it'll have more of a mouth-coating kind of thickness to the liquid, as opposed to just drinking the liqueur straight at room temperature. There we go. A little bit darker than our last two. That's from the sweet vermouth. We're going to take a lovely cocktail cherry here. Bingo right in. Give that guy a little stir around. I like my Manhattans garnished with a little bit of orange zest, so we're going to do that as well. All right, we'll give this guy a little twist up. looks good. There we go. Ba-ba. And last but not least, we're going to give this guy a little bit of a flamed orange peel. Now, flaming orange peel is totally optional as a garnish. There's a couple of cocktails that call for it, like a Martinez or a Vieux. And there we go. We've got ourselves a lovely 1887 Manhattan number 3. Absolutely delightful. So, if you want to come and taste test this out, Sherry, make sure it's to your liking.
It's delicious.
So hopefully I've illustrated how cocktails evolve over time, or at least how one cocktail evolved over time. You can scope out the links down below if you want to grab any of the equipment that I used today, or if you like what you saw and maybe want to contribute to the channel. Like and subscribe, and thanks again for joining us and making a Manhattan number 3, a fancy whiskey cocktail, and an old-fashioned. Hopefully we'll see you guys next time, and we'll talk a little bit more about cocktail history and make a couple more drinks.